Alright, so today I want to compare a small Marshall plexi head versus a big Marshall plexi head. I've actually had the Studio Vintage 20 watt head for about 3 years and the 1987X 50 watt head for about 2 years, but I never actually compared the both of them. So today I wanted to do a shootout for anyone who is looking for any of these two heads and wants to know which one to get. Both heads will be going through my Tone King Ironman 2 attenuator into my Marshall 4x12 cabinet loaded with Celestion greenback speakers, miking them with an SM57 and an MXL ribbon microphone. Both of them will be also going through my 2 notes Cap M cap simulator using the same cap sim, and the only pedal I'll be using is the Strymon Flint just for a little reverb, and I will check more effects later on in this video. To start things off, I will be running both amps in their default setting. Even though the EQ on both amps is the same, the volumes are set differently and they're patched differently. The reason for this is, once I got my 1987X, I quickly noticed it sounded and felt a bit different to my Studio Vintage. So I tweaked that to my liking, and somehow they felt and sounded the same to me when playing them separately, but I never put them back to back. So let's check how they actually compare in these settings. Not a huge difference in the recording, though to me it sounds like the 1987X sounds a bit bigger, while the Studio Vintage seems to have a bit more bite, even though it's plugged into the normal channel. But let's see what happens if we set the Studio Vintage to the exact same settings of my 1987X. Here the difference gets a lot bigger. The Studio Vintage gets a bit cleaner but a lot brighter on the default setting of the 1987X. While playing, it sounded a bit more metallic and didn't feel nor sound nearly as full. But let's turn it around and let's set the 1987X to the default setting of the Studio Vintage. With these settings, the 1987X gets a bit too thick for my taste, and it actually felt harder to play. Before I set it to the default settings of the Studio Vintage, I played this riff in the amp's own default setting, and it sounded and played a lot better. But let's take it down a notch, use some single coils, get the amps as clean as they can, and add some tremolo and slapback delay. Also here, the Studio Vintage is a lot brighter but also cleaner. I have noticed this before with both amps, but somehow it seems like the Studio Vintage, even though it has fewer tubes and lower wattage, has a bit more headroom than its bigger brother. The 1987X felt and sounded a lot nicer to play in the room. It had a lot more thumb and a more well-rounded tone, while the effects integrated better into the sounds. But now let's use the same settings, use some overdrive and fuzz and a P90 pickup. Once again, everything was set exactly the same, but you can hear the Studio Vintage sounds cleaner and brighter. But what you miss in these comparisons is the experience of how it actually feels and sounds to play both of these amps in the room. Of course, you can match them even better when you're recording, but I think there are fundamental differences between the two of these amps. Going back and forth between the two of them, I think the 1987X feels and sounds a bit nicer to play. It plays better with effects and it has a more balanced tone. The downside is it can be a bit boomy when recorded. The Studio Vintage lacks the thump and the roundness, and it can be somewhat metallic and bright at times, but it actually records really well and it doesn't break up as fast. To be honest, I am a bit surprised because I didn't anticipate this much difference between these two amps. Which one did you prefer? Do you own one or are you thinking about getting one? Let me know your experiences in the comments down below. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and I'll see you next time.